Good evening. It is Monday, February 3rd. This is a special meeting of the Board of Education to discuss Dr. Freeman's proposed budget. We may vote on that budget tonight, or we may continue our deliberations and carry the vote into our next meeting on Monday, February 10th. I would like to start the meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance and invite you to join us. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I will note that there were two agenda items for our meeting tonight. One, as I already mentioned, is a discussion and possible vote on Dr. Freeman's proposed budget. The other was a possible vote by the board to appoint someone to the open Board of Ed seat. We are going to put a hold on that vote, and we'll also put that onto our next meeting agenda. The board is simply not ready to hold that vote at this moment. Again, this is the board meeting to talk about the budget, to consider Dr. Freeman's proposed budget, to talk about things that the board would be interested in reducing or potentially adding. I would like, Dr. Freeman, if you would be willing, or would like to comment. We had two public forums last week, Monday and Tuesday. We heard from members of the public. We also received some email communication, and I wanted to give you the opportunity if there were things you wanted to respond to that we heard.
I'd be happy to, thank you. So we did hold 2 nights of public hearings last week at Adams Middle School on Monday or Tuesday. Across those 2 evenings, I believe we had 17 comments, members of the community who commented on the budget. There were a number of items that came up a number of different times, and so I'd be happy to respond. I think the most common comment that came up, or the most repeated comment that came up, and it does, the board received some emails as well, was about the increase of art teacher staffing at the elementary schools. I believe that I received about a dozen emails from members of the community asking to increase staffing to full-time staffing. I think the board received all of those as well. And I believe that across those 2 nights we heard 8 comments around the increase of art staffing at the elementary schools. My original draft budget did not include that recommendation to you, although this is the 2nd year that we have heard that request. And I'd like to reiterate for the board, my rationale in not including that staffing allocation was not because I disagreed with the value or the philosophy that the speakers shared. I think in general we heard that visual arts is a positive experience for elementary students. I believe we heard that parents and students alike, you heard some student speakers over those 2 days, find that the creative outlet is beneficial for them academically as well as socially and emotionally, that it's a positive experience for them. I know that over the past 2 years we've heard about the value of visual arts to divergent thinking, creative thinking, mathematical thinking, and I agree with all of that. While there is a financial implication to adding those 2 FTEs, my resistance continues to be around the scheduling challenges that would be related to that. At this time, to increase art contact time at the elementary schools, and if I'm hearing the suggestion about increasing from part-time to full-time teachers at each elementary, if embedded in that is a desire to double the art contact time, then we are struggling as a leadership team, as an administrative team, in how to do that, because we are currently only seeing 2 ways that we could possibly do that. One would be to increase the length of the elementary school day, and the other would be to reduce some other contact time. Going into that equation, I had shared with the board previously some work that we pulled together last year when we polled all of the other DIRG A and B school districts in the state. And what we shared with you was that of those school districts, we currently have the singular shortest school day of all the DIRG A and B districts, but at the same time, we're offering a similar or equivalent art program. When you look at those other school districts, most of them provide elementary art in the same way and to the same degree that we're currently providing art. And we continue to meet the state expectations that we address the art standards and that we have at least one standalone art class per week. And so it leaves us not disagreeing with the motivation or the intent behind the request. We just don't structurally see an opportunity to provide that at this time. And so it has not appeared in my recommendations to the board. And tonight, as you begin your deliberations, I again just have to say that should the board choose to add those 2 FTEs, we would of course follow any direction that you give us and figure that out moving forward. But it would likely mean reduction in contact in other scheduled areas, because we certainly wouldn't be extending the school day based on a budget decision made here. There's many more ramifications to extending the school day. I think some other comments that we heard were directly or tangentially related to that conversation around the art staffing at the elementary schools. So we could stop here if there's questions around the art staffing, or I can just keep plowing through, whatever you prefer.
People have questions, or would we like to hear more?
I think the full summary is a good way to start.
Yeah,
Continue.
Yeah.
Okay,
let's
thank
keep
you.
going.
So another item that we heard comment on was around the artist in residence, program that we had initiated this year, or practice that we had initiated this year. Not in direct response to the inability to schedule the additional art staffing last year, but certainly related to the concerns and the desires that we heard being raised. The board did set aside $10,000 last year with the suggestion that we find some way to enrich or enhance the art experience at the elementary schools. In early conversations, we had actually talked about using those dollars to provide art clubs at the schools in either before or after school settings. When we sat down past the budget season and worked with the principals, the first concern that we had about clubs was that they would not be equitable. Only students who could provide, only families who could provide transportation for their students either before or after school would have the opportunity to experience that sort of club setting. Again, talking with the principals, we fell upon the idea of the artist in residence, and the idea was to have a visiting or guest artist. We hoped to target practicing professional artists, and we thought that it was a good opportunity to sort of more formally engage in a relationship with the Guilford Arts Center. But the idea being that if we could place an artist in the school, it would not be the same as extending a relationship with a classroom teacher, but that it would give the students more exposure to art in the real world, and it would give them an enrichment activity in which they could engage. And one of our stated objectives was that it would help us to think more overtly and planfully in the schools about embedding those art standards into the regular classroom as well. There was a lot of conversation last year about the integration of the art standards into the regular classrooms. We are still early on in the launching of that experience this year. But initially, as we scheduled it and began to see the opportunity, we became excited about the thinking in this way, that if we doubled the opportunity, if we could have 2 experiences for every student in the elementary school each year, the idea was, think about a student in her elementary experience. If over 5 years, in addition to the art classes that she had scheduled, if she had the opportunity to meet and to work with, even for a short time, 10 professional practicing artists over those 5 years, a sculptor, a painter, a dancer, right now we're focused on the visual arts, but the idea wouldn't be to replicate the relationship with the teacher or to supplant the relationship with the teacher. But if each child came out of 5 years in the elementary school saying, I've met 10 artists and this one was really exciting and that is really interesting to me, would we be sparking something? Now, in the public hearings last week, we heard that the initial response to the Artist in Residence program was that it might not be worth the monies that were allocated to that. So as we move through the budget deliberations later tonight, I have identified that as an area that we need to consider. Cost benefit is absolutely something that we should consider, and if we floated an idea that is not getting the sort of response that we were hopeful for, then we should think about not funding that opportunity or reallocating those funds to fund something else. And so we did hear a number of comments through the public hearings, and most of them were questioning whether or not there was a cost benefit return on the dollars that had been allocated to that. Further, we heard some comments on the makerspaces. We had talked about creating makerspaces in each of the elementary schools. Again, this is not directly in response to the inability to extend art contact time, but I did make a connection, and I alternately referred to them as STEM makerspaces or as art and science makerspaces. It would be a reallocation of the current computer lab spaces that are going underutilized at the schools and creating more hands-on centers. What I took away from the public hearings, and a number of people commented on the makerspaces, was a concern that we haven't explained those centers thoroughly or well, that the parents who did comment aren't sure if it's STEM or art or a combination of both and how it would be used. And I heard concerns raised for how we are going to support the staff and train them for the usage in those spaces. Again, those are all really valid concerns that were raised. I do want to point out that in neither case, if we were to eliminate tonight both the makerspaces and the artist in residence dollars, I still don't have a solution for you for how we would schedule an extended art program. So I often say that items in the budget don't have one-to-one correspondence. Bless you. We will certainly talk about tonight reductions in the budget that I've provided. We'll certainly talk about other areas that need to be increased. But there's often not a direct one-to-one correspondence between different items in the budget. And I do need to say that at least from a planning perspective, I don't see a one-to-one correspondence between the art and science makerspaces, the artist in residence program, and those two art FTEs. There is some direct and some tangential connection, obviously, between and among those conversations. I think the other thing that we heard most about in the public hearings is we heard from our swim programs. We heard a parent talk about the girls' swim program, which at this point is a standalone Guilford team. And I heard that parent note that as the girls' swim team becomes more established in the school system, there continues to be a desire for the district to more fully fund that program. At this point, the girls' swim team boosters continue to raise significant funds to offset the costs to the district of that program. We also heard much more comment about the boys' swim program this year. Our cooperative with Branford ended last year, ended sort of abruptly when Branford really saw declining participation in their swim program. They were the host of our cooperative for the last several years. We are currently in another 2-year agreement in a multi-town cooperative that is being hosted in North Haven, and there were multiple requests, but sort of for two things. One, I did hear appreciation of the cooperative that's happening in North Haven. I heard that cooperative appreciates our participation in it, but I heard encouragement for this board to consider when that 2-year cooperative sunsets, that we try to work towards a standalone, fully funded boys swim team in Guilford in the same way that we currently have a standalone, fully funded, nearly fully funded girls swim team in Guilford. I also then heard, and I know that the board received some written correspondence around offsetting the costs that the parents are incurring in that collaborative. What is important to note is that as the host school in a collaborative, North Haven has control over the direct spending. North Haven essentially covers coaching costs and staffing decisions, transportation costs to away meets, and officiating costs. At the end of the season, they will essentially bill the other participating districts for our share of those costs. So we are contributing to the coaching costs, transportation costs, and officiating costs related to the boys' swim team. Not directly as a standalone team, but through the billing of the cooperative. The North Haven's a bit of a drive, and so the parents have also chosen to contract for busing transportation to and from practices at North Haven. I believe that we heard a request to either cover or offset those expenses. We've begun looking into how we would manage that. That is a little bit tricky because I believe the parents are contracting that bus individually. But if the board doesn't take action on the budget tonight, if you table a final decision until next Monday, we will be able to have a more full description. If the board chose to allocate funds for the boys' swim team beyond our share of the co-op cost, I will have a more fully explained rationale. Maybe somebody who's not on camera, there you go, camera can do that. I will by next Monday have a more fully detailed explanation as to how the board might choose to do that moving forward. I also know, and I think it was related to those swim conversations, there was some conversation that came up in the public hearing, and there was some follow-up conversation that I had with community members following those meetings about pay-for-play in Guilford, and about whether or not Guilford Public Schools fully funds our athletic programs. I know that Mr. Bloss used to say that we offset the costs of our athletic programming through an enormous spirit of volunteerism in the community. We have some of our most established booster organizations in the community, like around our football team and around our field hockey team, that have historically raised monies and have offset coaching costs, transportation costs, and equipment costs. I know that some of our younger athletic teams have individual differentiated arrangements because this board in the past has chosen, rather than denying the development of a new team, to enter into sort of cost-sharing agreements with the community that wanted to see a crew team or a swim team in the last several years. I think that the best opportunity for the board would be for us to schedule an agenda item for an upcoming workshop meeting where we ask Mr. Jarvis and Mrs. Trudeau to join us, Mr. Macenti will join us, and I think we need to have a fully fledged conversation about the taxpayer budget-based funding for athletics, the booster club contributions to athletics, and the rather organic nature of the cost-sharing relationship that we have the team. I will note, and I did bring copies for the board tonight, in the summer of 18, we sent a letter to the entire school community making it clear that Guilford Public Schools does not charge for participation in our athletic programs, but explaining that rich history of booster programs and the fact that booster programs will approach parents whose students are on teams asking for direct contributions or participation in fundraising activities. The letter both encouraged families to support those booster programs, because those booster programs support our athletic programming, but also made clear that a family's inability or lack of interest in participating in that fundraising in no way precludes their children from participation in any of our after-school or athletic programs, and directs parents who have any questions or concerns to contact our athletic office. At a minimum, on the heels of the workshop conversation that we have, I think we need to be more diligent about making sure that that communication becomes a regular annual communication, so that people are at least less likely to feel community or peer pressure about making contributions to a program. I don't think we'll ever be able to eliminate it if this is the way that we continue to structure the relationship, but I do think that being clear and transparent about it is necessary and would be helpful. And I know I brought those letters. I just want to take a minute to find, there they are. So again, this is a copy of the letter that was dated August of 2018. I don't believe we sent it out in August of 2019. And I believe that unless we make some significant structural changes, it is something that we should continue to send out. I think those were my major takeaways from the public hearings and the emails that we had been receiving.
Okay.
Again, I'm happy to have conversation about those, and again, as I do annually, I've also taken the liberty of creating a bit of a worksheet and creating a general idea of what we've heard about additions and reductions to your budget moving forward, and I offer it only as a starting point for your conversation whenever you're ready for me to
Okay.
share that.
Well, so I will say that, not surprisingly, as we were also all at those public forums, right? That each of us heard the comments around elementary art. We heard the comments around maker spaces. We heard the requests, a couple of the requests around the swim teams specifically. And I can say as the chair that I think there are probably several topics that we will want discussed tonight, and I certainly invite board members to add to this list as we move forward in our discussion tonight. But I think certainly elementary art is one. Maker spaces is another. Perhaps consider a swim team, although Dr. Freeman, it sounds, you're being quite clear that that may be a discussion that would be a better informed discussion next week. And again, what we may really find tonight to be most useful is really deliberating any particular interest of the board to talk to any of these topics, but considering also identifying whether there are areas in addition to that where we might want a little bit more information from the administration before making any final decision. I imagine that there may be interest in other potential additions, right, to this budget as well that we may want to consider.
I've identified a few of those to start.
Right,
but
right.
Happy to discuss
There
any
may
place you
be
wanna add.
consideration, right, about the tuition line. It
Right.
is absolutely our hardest budget line to predict. Our special services department here at the schools works very, very closely with Mrs. Trudeau and the business department to try to predict as best as we can, but that is a difficult one. There may be some interest in talking about the pension line a little bit. I know that's been a topic in the past. And there may be others. So, I think perhaps where we can start is on any one of these topics with any board member who would like to share an interest, right? Dr. Hirsch is raising his hand, essentially.
I'd like to talk about the art situation.
Okay.
Because the fundamental question that's been raised in the hearings for 2 years has been, in some sense, the value and importance of art. It's less that we already meet state standards, but rather, ought we be doing more? And there's just a lot of evidence that it's good, that it's a valuable experience on all grounds. So the question I have is, if we decided as a board, through further discussion, that we ought to be doing more, but we understand the structural problems. We got two structural problems. We got three. We got money questions, we've got time questions, and we've got curricular questions in terms of those things. But if we were to first get a chance to have a conversation about, would this be a priority? If we could find the money and we agreed that we ought to do more, let's just say a teacher in every school in the next several years, is there a possibility that we could figure out ways of doing that, such as increasing time? On the other hand, we don't want to be naive. If increasing time, and you probably got to talk about, you can't talk 10 minutes. You got to talk about something substantial. Would we tear the community apart by having another time discussion where people say, we love art, but we don't love another half hour, and we have a problem with the busing? So at some point, we need to just have a discussion, say, how do we solve these problems? If at all possible, is there a way of doing that? Including, is there any time we can take away from, is there anything that someone's going to give up? I mean, is art more important than math or language or science or social studies? So, I mean, in theory, there's a simple solution. We find more money, we find more time. That's easy said, but we've been through the conversation about time in this district. And at some point, then I think that, and so making a decision right now about what we should do for art without understanding that is difficult. But how do we, from this point on, try to have a full discussion so that, in fact, we don't sit in meetings next year with the community reacting as if nothing has happened? That's really what I'm concerned about.
I have a question that sort of goes along with it, and it's very simplistic, but we did hear a couple of thoughts on some creative ideas for the scheduling. One of which was comments about Monday holidays.
Right.
And there's one elementary school principal in the audience, and I don't know specifically how specials are scheduled when the teachers are shared, but maybe there could be some thoughtfulness in scheduling at a minimum for next year, and making sure the art teacher isn't always at one school on Mondays, every year.
Yes, we heard two suggestions at least, one of which was a repeat from last year. And one was that if we moved from a fixed 5-day, day-of-the-week schedule to a rotating 6-day. Now, I heard two suggestions. One is I heard that would increase time, and two, I heard it would solve the Monday off problem. It doesn't necessarily increase time. It likely won't, because it would just be one touch every 6 days, and it would likely spread out to be equal, but it would solve that. And then the second suggestion that we heard was just that the schools with shared staff flip the staff every other year. So
Right.
at least if LEAT always has art on Mondays, which means LEAT students will always drop art, some LEAT students will always drop art on a Monday off, that we at least flip-flop that scheduling. So yes, we can certainly say that we will look at the scheduling and try to address the other concerns that were brought up that weren't necessarily about absolute time. Additionally, we can continue to commit to finding better opportunities and more opportunities to work with our teaching staff to integrate the art standards into the regular education classrooms. So we have started using, when we debrief some of the grade level district-wide units, we have started not just debriefing the literacy and the content standards, but talking about the art standards at the same time. We can certainly talk about opportunities to work with the literacy and math coaches at the elementary level so that they can be more supportive of teachers integrating the art standards into the teaching at those levels. And again, if we choose not to continue with an artist in residency program, that we find alternative ways to continue to provide that kind of professional learning and integrating of the standards. We could continue to look at scheduling. At this point, after 4 years of the high school start time scheduling conversations, one of the immediate concerns is that the first way to increase the day is either to start earlier or end later. Starting earlier, if we don't do something different to the bus runs, will require pushing the high school earlier again. Remember, we pushed the elementaries 5 minutes later to accommodate the high school conversations. And I agree, the idea of ending 5 or 10 minutes later might be palatable, but I don't think would be significant to the needs or the desires that have been expressed. Ending 20 or 30 minutes later might be significant to addressing the desires that have been expressed, but I don't know would be palatable. I tend to think it's not going to be palatable by the broader community. And again, the only other solution would be to do something different in busing, and that is either going to be financial or structural. We would have to change the limits of our busing capacity if we were going to lengthen the elementary school day without impacting the high school start time or the elementary end time. So those are big questions, and the further you get into them, our experience is the further you move away from instruction.
So if one had eventually an art teacher in every school, and the role of that art teacher may not only be able to offer courses, but in some sense could team teach units worked out with the other teachers. The big question there would be whether or not the regular faculty would find that they have enough time to do that.
You would still run into that time crunch, and
Yeah, I mean, you're going to be backing out another subject to do that, even if you have two teachers in the room. Are you teaching English or are you teaching art?
and
You still got the same block of time.
and team teaching is not something that happens naturally or instinctively.
No.
There's actually a lot of
Finding
training.
time.
Yes, there's a lot of need that it's not as easy as both walking into the classroom at the same time.
If we had 30 elementary school teachers here from a building and said, if we could put more art personnel in the building, would you be able to, over a certain amount of time, work out a plan that you think is beneficial to you and to the children at the same time that we just aren't thinking of? Or would they say to us, we've been thinking about this for a while, and, we don't have enough time for what we're doing now. And we love the idea of more, but that's not going to solve the problem either.
Our initial response is often, we don't have time for what we're doing now. As we ask our teachers to take on more literacy, more math, more literacy and math in their social studies and science curriculum, we do have a new science curriculum and new science standards to meet, and we're asking them to take on much more responsibility around social emotional wellness. When I ask teachers that question, I tend to hear that they're struggling with what we're asking of them now. And again, I just want to note, there's no other school district with a shorter school day than we have. Now, there's lots of reasons for that, and that's where we are, and extending it's going to be difficult, but I don't ever want to lose sight of that when we think about what we're asking of our staff within those minutes. When we moved to full-day kindergarten, we tried to be very aware of the fact that we did not want to double the kindergarten expectations. We, in fact, wanted to keep them where they were and double the time available to meet those expectations. I'm not sure if we hit that mark exactly. I'm sure kindergarten is much more academic than it was 20 years ago. But we were just really concerned about, and again, I know that art is also a release to the students, right? I know that as I talk about the stress of the school day, art is a way to relieve that stress, but we still have to find the time available to do it in one way or the other.
Well, can I make a suggestion? I mean, I don't feel that I understand all the implications of increasing the elementary school day, let's say by 20 minutes. I mean, I understand it's complex, and I understand it affects busing and some other things.
I didn't even mention the 5 bargaining units. We would
Yeah,
have to,
well,
we would have
that's
to carefully
another
look at all
issue.
5 of our
Yeah,
contracts.
and that may have a cost to it also.
Correct.
But I think it would be helpful if we could have a workshop meeting where we went over this in detail. And we looked at all of the options to see how, if there is a way to do this. I mean, the fact that we have the shortest elementary school day tells me that other districts have somehow found a way to have
longer days.
longer days. And so I just think we need to work through this. And I don't know if, maybe there's all kinds of opposition to the idea of flipping the high school and the elementary school start time and, all of the busing implications of that. But I think we need to look at this more carefully, and I don't think we're going to get that done tonight.
No.
So can I ask a clarification? You're asking to look more carefully at the length of our elementary school day.
Right, and to see if there are ways to extend it.
Okay.
And what the
And I'm totally open.
implications-
I think more conversation is always helpful. I am remembering school start time conversations in which
I agree.
I think we have a number of parents who were upset. In fact, right, were upset at a 10-minute later discharge time at the end of the day because of how it increased, or I'm sorry, these lights in this room
Very
keep going out.
Really
That it
enjoying the
increased, right,
conversation.
it made, their kids were getting home later, it made it hard to get it after school.
Yeah,
Which
got
resulted in a
dark.
5-minute compromise,
Which
then-
literally had us then create a 5-minute compromise, which
Right.
created some bus issues, right? So I want to name for the parents watching, that if we look at this, and I have no problem looking at it, I think it always behooves us to understand alternatives, that this is not a decision, that it's not necessarily direction we're going in, and that we heard a number of parents, at least, during those conversations, that were very concerned about kids getting out 10 minutes later than they had previously. The idea of 20 minutes or 30 minutes, I think, would be highly problematic, at least from those parents we already heard from. And I just want that said out loud so
Yeah.
that people on camera hear me acknowledging we heard those conversations and were present for them.
Well, I think it's part of the big conversation that we had last year, with the hopes that while we made, not what we were hoping to make in a start
Right.
time change, but hoping that that wasn't the end of the conversation, and that, there's still some kind of a hope that there's more time, or there's more opportunity for the high school and middle school kids to sleep longer. And this is just a piece of that, right?
Yeah, and I do think that, and I know it's difficult to ask for patience, but I do think that we may have some opportunity to learn from some other districts. Norwalk has just announced that they will, as a district, be moving to an hour later high school start times. They have not yet released details on how they will achieve that. They're a much larger school district than Guilford is. New Canaan, which is about the same size, maybe a little smaller, but much better resourced than Guilford, has recently announced that they will be moving their high school start time by a full hour or close to an hour, and they are looking at flipping the elementaries and the high school. So,
That's what
right,
I
I
heard.
believe that as interest in high school start times continues, we may see more models for change that we found. Now, I don't think there's going to be anything we didn't think of, but we may see people who implement things in ways that we didn't think we
Right.
would be able to successfully implement.
Yes, good
So there may be some opportunity to learn from some other experiences around the state, rather than piloting everything here in Guilford, right? We can hold off and see what some other changes look like.
So that sounds like a request, right, for further conversation on this issue of kind of school day, which is impacted by this
Art
elementary
request.
art question.
I have two topics for upcoming workshops, pay for play and athletic funding, and then separately, the length of the elementary school day, coming from the concern, and I'll just say that, right, the concern has been there's been some concern about recess time and free play, as well as the concern
Right.
for art and
Yes,
creative
that's
outlets.
true.
So I think both of those
Right.
feed into, we're not looking to extend the school day, the elementary school day, for more math. I want to be clear about that. That's not the impetus behind that conversation, but I'm happy to schedule those two workshop meetings moving forward.
Great.
I think they'll be two really
Yeah, it'd be fun.
healthy conversations, probably even keep the lights on.
If you will, Dr. Freeman, sorry.
No,
Can we go back to the six-day schedule at the elementary schools? Us as a board, what are we missing here? What are the difficulties in moving ahead with that? Now, I know it's not going to solve the art timing solution. It's not the solution. But it is solving, if you have it on a Monday, you're not going to miss it. Tell me
So-
what are the hurdles to that?
One of the biggest concerns that we hear most often from the elementary principals is developmentally and from a parent perspective. We do tend to see 6, 7, even 8-day rotating schedules that begin to be commonly used at the middle and the high school grades. And you end up with letter days that may go A through D or A through F, and it's on this rotating schedule. It tends to be at the elementary level that because of shared staff, because of the developmental level of the students in the school, and sometimes because of parental schedules, that we stay more traditionally to a Monday through Friday schedule. It makes scheduling easier, it makes it more predictable, it makes it less feel like that day is swirling around their heads and they don't know what they're walking into. It's easy. I mean, in fact, in the younger elementary grades, we're doing calendar work. And so for them to know that we're sitting on the carpet and doing calendar work and it's February and today is a Monday, they also know that Monday comes along with these specials. The downside is that everybody in the world schedules their week by the days of the week, and so you end up with the problems about dropped Mondays that we've heard. Right, and so it tends to be, and I'm looking to Mr. Grimm and inviting him to the table if I've missed any part of that description. I know the board would be happy to have you come join us, Bill, because I know that we looked at this a little bit last year. Nice.
Sorry, Bill.
I think one of the biggest things developmentally is just, the younger kids need the routine.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the most important things, is that they have a predictable routine to their school day, their school week. I think the other challenge is when you share staff between
Right.
schools, even if it's between the elementary schools, and sometimes the staff we share aren't even full-time staff. So, just kind of coordinating that and figuring all that out. If you had full-time staff only in your school all the time, you could have more flexibility in how that schedule rotates, and you could say, for the first couple months, we'll have art on this schedule, and then for the next couple months, we'll switch it, and we'll figure out how, I can count all my Monday classes and sessions, and I can count all my days of the week sessions, and make sure it comes out to be fairly equitable. I think one of the other challenges is we have some teachers that are on, 0.8 FTE, and some of those teachers work 5 days but have a shortened schedule during the course of the day, and some of those teachers work 4 days a week and have one of the days off.
Yeah.
Speaking just for myself personally, out of respect for that person who maybe needs to pick up some other work, that may not work, that it's Monday this week, and it's Tuesday the following week, and it's Wednesday the following week.
That's hard.
And we want to be careful. That is a selfish concern, because we will have a harder time holding on to the quality part-time teach. So it's not just a concern about the individual,
This is
which
the
is fair,
information
but
I
it's
was
secondary
hoping
to
the board
student
would get.
concerns.
Right.
But
Yeah.
that
That's
becomes a
helpful, right?
student concern when
Thank
we
you.
have a harder time holding on to quality part-time staff, because we will
legitimate.
not compete
Yeah.
with other districts who are on a different kind of schedule.
It's very easy for us to say, why not just do a 6-day schedule? This is the information that's helpful.
Right.
So, thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Bill, do you see a similar concern when we're talking about flip-flopping Mondays and the other day, that discussion? Is that going to be
Like
impacted, or is
a
that
year-to-year
easier?
basis, I mean, when I was at Calvin Lee, we had art on the Mondays and the Fridays.
Both of the worst days.
Yeah, I mean,
Is there an opportunity to maybe say, okay, for September and October, kindergartners have art on Monday? And could you switch it up? I know it's a little confusing for the
That's-
children, but could you look at something
so
like
now
that? Or
I have art at A.W. Cox on Thursdays and Fridays.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, I can always adjust
It's not as
schedules
big
and
an
things like
issue,
that.
right, yeah.
But the schedule, it's,
I
there's
know.
domino effect. So once
Yeah,
you
that's
switch,
right, that's
I
right.
once you
know,
switch
Then
one's
everything else
art
has to
from
switch.
Friday to Thursday, then you have to
Gym
flip
has
something
to
back
switch,
over to
and-
I know.
Friday, and then it
Yeah.
impacts this,
Yeah,
and
that's-
I know.
it's just a.
Well, is there a different way that we haven't thought about of
Right.
making sure that students aren't missing
One
5 or 6
particular
art
subject.
classes because they go on the same day? Is there another solution to that?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that at the elementary level, we have had the conversation about, from year to year, changing the days when we
Okay.
have our
Right, right.
itinerant staff
Right.
at each place.
That might do it.
I think
Yeah.
it's, traditionally, that's just the,
We need
one
to-
school
we need to
had
make sure
art
we're
on
doing
these
that.
days, and that's when it's always been, and that's
Yeah.
what it's gonna always be.
And that's not a good reason to
But,
continue.
yeah, that's not
Okay.
enough reason.
Well, that's-
But
that's-
we can have those
that's
conversations,
parsimonious.
for sure, yeah, so. And I think we could, you can always put together a schedule for the second half of the year. I'd be interested to kind of go back a year or two and actually count when the days are, because we have snow days on other days too. Snow days don't just occur on Mondays. So I think that, I'm not sure it's as unequal
Okay.
as we think it might
Okay,
be.
well, that's
but
legitimate.
It might be a couple sessions difference between a Monday and I think schedule-wise, if you looked at, here's when it's scheduled, if we don't miss any days
Yes,
and all that.
it's gonna be bad.
It's a little bit unbalanced, but I think in the long run, when you look at the whole school year, if you miss 3 days, a Thursday, Friday or something for snow, and the days get added on at the end of the year are a Monday and a Tuesday,
Sure.
kind of, it may have,
Balances out.
Right.
may
Interesting.
bounce out a little bit. but-
Okay.
Sorry about that, but thank you, Mr. Grimm.
No, that was
Thank you.
extremely helpful.
That
Thank
that
you.
is helpful.
Does anyone else want to talk more about elementary art right now?
Yeah,
Ask
just
more
one other.
questions?
The only other question really had to do with the artist in residence and how it evolved from a, curriculum after school based, club based, to where it is now. Now, I understand that, we were looking for equity
Yep.
and making sure that everyone had equal access to it. How is the curriculum, how is the program set up now? Who is running it? How are these artists, coming up with their plans, per se?
So right now, it lives primarily with the elementary principals and then some collaboration with me. Remember, this program got designed while we had 50% of the elementary principal staff turnover. So from the time that we approved the funding and to the time that we tried to launch this, we lost 2 of our principals and brought in 2 new principals. And so, like a lot of things in education, this is being designed as we roll it out. The idea was that if we create a year-long club that meets once a week, it might impact 20 students who had a great experience because they had the interest and the families had the capacity to allow those students to stay after on every Tuesday or every Thursday for an extra hour. We had also thought about whether or not it would have to be half a year at each of the schools and rotate around because of funding and the teacher contract and how we fund clubs. The idea to bring in a guest artist or an artist in residence was that it would immediately then impact all the students for a far shorter time, right? It wouldn't be all year long, 1 day a week. It would be maybe just one exposure, but it would be a way to bring in somebody who was, again, practicing in the field. If you look at the story on our website, you can see the resume of the well, not a resume, but you can see highlights from the resume of the artists that we brought in. And it would give a bridge. The activity began in the art room but was completed in the classroom, that it would be a way to also highlight for the classroom teachers the idea of those art standards in the classroom. It's not fully realized yet. We're just launching it. What's happened in 2 schools, it hasn't happened in the next 2 schools. We've yet to have time to debrief, even debrief this experience. Right. But the first thing we realized was, wouldn't it be great if we could do it once early in the fall and then once later in the spring? And again, it was that idea of just touches, just contacts. We know that we're focusing on the visual arts now, but wouldn't it be great if we could bring in a choreographer or a dancer or somebody who was involved in other areas of art, and so that the students were getting just that exposure to other opportunities, and that the teachers were thinking about that bridge, and then how could we better begin building those art standards into the thinking and the debriefing and the planning of the regular classroom teacher. Now again, we want to do that in a way that is slow and respectful. Just quite honestly, the science standards do have priority this year in that placement because the science standards are newly adopted. We've just launched the new curriculum. We are bringing in new materials and supports. Additionally, we're revisiting the way that we address phonics in the elementary classroom, especially in the youngest grades. So there needs to be some rollout and support for the teachers around phonics. And again, these are the same teachers. And so we want to be able to sort of be slow. There's an element, if you build it, they will come, which is the same idea to the way that we have been talking about rolling out those art and science maker spaces. Put the space in the room, make it really tempting for teachers, and teachers are going to be asking for and finding their own ways to find really good activities and tasks that they could translate into those spaces. Spend a year telling people you're training them for the new technology that you're going to introduce, and you get a very different response. And so that's where we are in the thinking. It was the teacher in residence much more than the makerspace was more directly tied to the inability to, or our unreadiness to schedule 2 more full-time art teachers and to try to find alternatives. But I'm not revealing a state secret when I tell you that many of the things that we're going to roll out in the district will roll out as we're designing the final pieces rather than having everything nailed down before we launch something.
So, just as a follow-up, and so that I'm clear, as the Artist in Residence program stands right now, if my student goes to LEAT school, how much time would my student be spending with the artist in residence? How would it impact my student?
The artist would be in the building for that full week, and
For a
then
full week.
they would be scheduling one additional art class for every group where that individual would be sharing their art, their experience, the medium that they work in, and then translating that into some kind of actual activity that the students could get their hand on. So in this case, if you look, you're going to see that this artist works with media that I can't fully define, but had our students do sort of a version of her work in really simple media that they're already very familiar with. It's more about the exposure and the excitement of the extra opportunity. And then there was intentionally this bridge where there was that one extra art class, but that the activity finished back in their regular classroom. So that their classroom teacher was involved in that activity and that we were making a connection. It's obviously a little artificial and obviously sort of simplistic, but a connection from the classroom to the art studio. And again, the design idea was if you do that 10 times over their 5 years of experience, they will see that art connects to the classroom multiple times. The idea behind the makerspace is similar in that sometimes the activities happen in the classroom, but sometimes the learning happens in this real hands-on space, and that students begin to see this fluidity between their learning spaces and an integration between the learning spaces. So, right, I'm explaining all this. We haven't rolled all this out, sort of explicitly to all the teaching staff yet. The teachers might not know that that's part of the design, but that's what the principals and I were thinking as we were moving down that road.
Okay.
It is essentially one extra exposure, but it's also that professional in my school for the whole week. So I may not be in class with her every day, but I see her moving through my school, I see her talking to teachers, I see her in the lunchroom, and again, artists are in the spaces that we inhabit.
Okay, and so, the proposal to double the funds would mean that there would be a second exposure, much as there is now, and it may come at 2 different time periods, but it would look like the same as it does now, only twice.
That's the
Okay.
general
Twice as
thinking
much.
without having debriefed this experience at all.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Can I ask a question, Paul, more on this artist in residence? Is just, how is it determined what this artist will be bringing in terms of a curriculum or a goal for the week or a lesson plan, if you will? And like, how are they selected and how I mean, that may be more detailed than, or maybe it's a thing that's evolving and we're kind of learning from the first go-around, like we do with a lot of things.
This time it was easy because it was the first time. We
Right.
knew that part of our desire was to begin building the relationship with the Guilford Arts Center. So for us, and again, this one was easy because it was the first. It was reaching out to the Guilford Arts Center, asking, or, sitting with them and explaining our idea and asking if they had somebody that they thought would be a good fit. It is going to begin to get more challenging as we start to go through a cycle of 10, right? We're not going to now want to invite this particular person back or somebody who works in the same medium doing the same kinds of activity. So as we move down the line, it's going to get more challenging each time where we say, we had a dancer 2 years ago, we're not ready to bring back another choreographer. What haven't we exposed this cohort of students to yet? So ultimately, the idea would be to create this rotating piece. We want these individuals to come in and share what they do professionally. And so we have shared the art standards with the Guilford Arts Center.
Okay.
There's got to be a connection to the art standards that we are working towards. But the idea is to have, again, we have authors come in and speak all the time. Now, authors only come in and speak for one day usually, but we want the authors to come in and talk about their work. It's the same idea. Somebody who can come in and I'm a sculptor, let me expose you to the 3D work that I do. I'm a potter, let me expose you to the way that we work with clay. And so again, bringing the real world in rather than, and it's certainly taking time away from something else, but it's taking that one exposure away from something else that's happening in the same way that Mr. Grimm has an artist or a writer come in, the students will schedule a period to go visit that author, talk about her books, talk about his work, and hear from a real live practitioner.
Is there a way to ensure it's not, I don't want to use the word redundant. I know when I was on the PTO at one of the elementary schools, we had a very strong, through the PTO, enrichment committee. And we brought in some amazing, performers and storytellers and puppeteers. And so is there a way to ensure that it's not redundant, and right, if we've already scheduled
That's why
a
the
dance
first one is
performance.
easy, yes.
Yeah, right,
Yes.
right, yeah.
And that falls to the principals and Dr.
Okay.
Crystal and myself
Okay.
to make sure that we're not using the same media, doing
Right.
the same thing twice in 1 year or
Yeah.
even twice in 2 or 3 years because the students are going to see that as redundant. Yep,
Right.
exactly so.
Okay.
So the virtue of this, in light of the fact that we don't have full-time art teachers in every school, the virtue is that any and all artists in some planful way that comes into school signals both to staff and to students that we actually value art. The fact that this first year may not have been perfect, or that even if it were, in 3 years we might run out of ability to recruit, at the moment, this inadvertently at least, has the virtue of signaling and has in the budget some dollars that we may decide in a year should be transferred to either the two teachers. In other words, we can build on this and learn from it, however rough things are now. So I'd want to be cautious about where we
Cutting it.
Understood.
Understood.
And at one point, the recommendation was to put double that, as it were. So is there any way of judging about what percentage of the artists in residence this past year worked versus, would everybody say 60% of the time it was really good? And we heard some people who were critiquing it, but if you're doing 60% on a new idea, that's not bad. It's a big bang for the buck. So I don't want to lose sight of the fact that there may already be something we can gain, and that, in fact, we can't lose if, in fact, we're building into our value system and our budget something about art.
We need to sort of debrief this. We need to find out what the students took away. We need to ask parents what their experience of it was. We need to talk to the teachers. And we need to model what we preach to the students and learn from our implementation and our mistakes. And so if this was not exactly right, then we need to learn from that and make it better next year. All that said, I do have it listed on your sheet tonight for consideration, but this is why we have these conversations, because this is going to inform your consideration of do we double the funding? Do we continue the funding at its current level, or do we eliminate the funding because we've heard some feedback that we're not seeing a return on this investment?
Well, I think we listen, right?
Yep.
We have all the public forums. I think we try to make it very clear that this board listens to everything parents and community members want us to hear. Like I said, that we can't always do everything for a number of reasons. And I do think it's a good idea to continue to pursue the Artist in Residence program. I'm not sure that we heard much, if all, support for it from the parents, so I would be hesitant to double that amount without
Yep.
sort of getting a handle on the program and how it works, and now we're 1 year in, what can we do?
Well, look, I mean, I kept some notes on this. The reaction from the people who were interested in art was uniformly very negative to this program. I think everybody that I remember who spoke about art wanted us to drop this program. And
Well,
so,
I didn't hear
Everybody
that.
who named the Artist in Residence program was, I think, critical of it. But remember, we had fewer than 20 people total. We didn't survey every student and parent who had
I
the
understand
exposure.
that,
Yep.
but
Yes, you're
but it
correct.
did strike me that nobody stood up and said they had a good experience with this.
No, of the comments we heard publicly on Monday and Tuesday, that's correct.
And so I think that my colleague's suggestion that at a minimum, we shouldn't be doubling a program which we don't seem to have optimized yet is something we ought to think about. I'm not sure that it makes sense to kill this idea
In its infancy.
prematurely,
Mhm.
but it doesn't strike me that it's time to roll this out big time because we're just not getting the feedback that we've got it fine-tuned yet.
Can I
So-
just as a counterpart to that, though, only just because having some experience in working on these enrichment programs for several years in elementary level, the budget, if you divvied that if you said it was 2,500 was it the single artist that was gone to all 4 schools that was given this one budget?
So
Or was it
it was a
4 separate
contract with the
artists?
Guilford Arts Center for
Right.
$10,000, which provided 4 weeks or 20 days of contact, which if you were looking just at the contact time directly and no time set aside for planning, and it's probably planning once, not each of the 4 times,
Right.
but you're looking at approximately $500 $500 a day, which is
Right.
not an unusual amount for us to be
Well,
contracting
this,
in
I guess, was
professional
my
development.
point,
Yes.
is that to have a program that maybe has a little more impact than a piece of cardboard for each student and to mimic a Mandela, you actually, and having done these programs before, it requires more, and to really have an impactful project, beyond just glue and paper for that many students. But I think these artists can be creative with the existing budget. I'm just saying that we may see some of the same pitfalls or similar pitfalls in terms of the parental response, because they will still, the end result, like the tangible thing that their children bring home may still be simplistic.
Well, so if you,
because of
right,
that.
and increasing the funding, while I keep talking about increasing the funding allows you the opportunity to double the exposure, the other thing it allows you to do is to just deepen the existing contact time. And so
Yeah,
would it
right.
allow you to bring in a different kind of presenter or more expensive materials or, right, so,
Right.
right, I keep saying that can be a fall and a spring experience. It could be one experience, but for 2 consecutive weeks, or one experience that is for a longer period of time within the week with more expensive materials or more involved. It might be more than one person coming. I mean, there's lots of ways that you could think about it. But again, the budget as it sits in front of you has $20,000 in it. The board can zero that out, the board can reduce it to 10, the board can leave it at 20, the board could increase it. I mean, right, we can go and,
So I've heard, I'm going to make a suggestion here. I think I'm hearing 2 possible proposals. One is to retain the funding at 10,000. Another is to consider or adopt the increase to 20,000. I think I'm going to suggest that we recognize at the moment those two possible proposals and go on to any, to other discussion points. This is a very healthy conversation, but it's also lasted an hour, and I don't want to lose
That's fine.
the opportunity for other questions, clarifications, comments.
If I may, could I move on to the makerspaces?
That was where I was going next.
So the makerspaces, what I took away from that conversation and the recommendation that I'd like to make to the board tonight is that I think that it would be prudent to delay a rollout of the makerspaces. Now, I want to be
Defer.
clear. I'm not walking away from the rollout of the makerspaces, but what I heard were a lot of questions about what is the intent, how should the space be used, and how will the teachers be supported. And I guarantee that concern about how will the teachers have an opportunity to learn and be supported will be echoed by the teachers themselves. So I think that it makes complete sense at this time to withdraw the new funding that is in the budget for the makerspaces, but I want you and the community to know that Dr. Crystal and I and the elementary principals will talk about opportunities to get the idea and the structure of makerspaces out in front of the elementary communities. So again, I've mentioned that Wallingford is a community that has done good work in this area. There are numerous others that we could invite a teacher who has experience with makerspaces to come to our elementary schools and talk to our existing elementary staff. That Dr. Crystal and/or I be sure that we join a PTO meeting across this next school, it straddles two school years, but across the next calendar year, and talk to the PTOs about the opportunities that we see in makerspaces. Additionally, there's a little complication around the funding of this line.
And that-
Right, $50,000 of this is new equipment money that we had added to the budget. There's another $50,000 that we had earmarked to be pulled out of the technology lease to go to some of the equipment that would land there. Reducing the technology lease at this point is not going to generate a one-to-one savings. Remember, these are dollars that we're leasing over 5 years. If we reduced that lease by $50,000, you wouldn't recognize a $50,000 reduction in this budget. It would be spread across 5 years, and you'd have to back out the funding ratio there. So my suggestion is that we reduce the budget, well, my suggestion is going to be, that we reduce the equipment line by the $50,000 that was allocated. The lease, I believe, should stay where it is. Mr. Mitchell never is able to budget everything that he's looking for in that technology lease. So the monies that we had told him we wanted him to allocate towards the makerspace equipment, we can do two things with. One is we can buy smaller numbers of some of the similar equipment, and we can find other locations in the building to sort of seed some of that equipment. A 3D printer could be purchased for each elementary school, and it could live in a classroom with a teacher who has particular interest in that technology. It could live in a media center. It could live in the art studio. And we could draw teacher attention to the opportunities that that piece of equipment provides. And I think it could help us as we develop the interest among the staff and among the parents at the elementary level. And then, if and when makerspaces come forward in a future budget, whether it's next year or in a future year, that you'll hear greater interest, that you'll hear teachers and parents talking about, we've been talking about this for some time, and we'd love to have a makerspace in our building. And in fact, I know that this teacher has a 3D printer down the other end of that hallway. It really should be in a generalized location that everybody has access to so that they can use it and have access to it. So that would be my recommendation to you based on what we heard around the makerspace idea through those public hearings.
Excuse me.
So all in
I
all,
do- oh.
go ahead.
No, sorry. I do want to say that I think there was definitely some sense on the board that this would be an item that we would also suggest for this year removing, for the reasons that you've noted. I think there's some concern about a better sense of specifically what they could offer, specifically how teachers could use them, how they might be resourced both for any kind of instruction that
Yep.
might really enhance the use of these spaces. I think that that I've heard from colleagues here, and now then I will pass on to John and others who want to speak more specifically. There was a sense that we were not quite ready for this, and not the board, the school system. We were not as well prepared for it as we could be with more research and as you have already suggested.
Sometimes an
Please,
idea needs a
Dr.
little time to cook before it's
Yeah,
ready.
yeah, yeah. Mr. Dillon, go ahead.
Tell me more about the cost associated with it, because I know we heard numbers of 50,000 for the technology lease. The other 50,000, what was covered under that?
So there was an itemized cost list that we had put together, but essentially it was some technology equipment like 3D printers, cameras, monitors, right? The sort of the hardware side to some of that.
That's in the lease portion.
That would be in the lease
Okay.
portion. There were other pieces that were literally sort of the craft materials that you would think of. It was cutting boards, it was scissors, it was right? There's a lot of the stuff that goes into those spaces that is consumable. I think that the really exciting ones do a lot of it with repurposed recycled materials, but the fact is there's a lot of stuff that kids need to be able to prototype. So they need wooden dowels and wheels, they need cardboard, they need construction paper, they need all kinds of tape, they need glue, right? And so a lot of it is that. I'm trying to remember if there's...
What about the cost of repurposing these 4 rooms, though? Was that covered in that 50, or was that another line item somewhere?
No, that was actually minimal. So the rooms are essentially set up now as computer labs. So most of them have built-in cabinetry around the
Got it.
perimeters, and some of them have peninsula or island cabinetry and countertops in the middles. So they're actually really usable spaces for exactly the kinds of activities that we want.
Okay.
Students are going to need the room is going to need lots of cabinet space to store lots of stuff, and the kids are going to need lots of open space and table space to be able to build things and get messy. And so the rooms themselves were not going to require any heavy remodeling or reconfiguring.
Thank you.
I love the idea of the makerspace. I think they sound like so much fun, and I think you're absolutely right. I think delaying it a year gives us the opportunity to even let the community almost help populate the space. Like, I wonder if there isn't an architect in town who's buying a new 3D printer and they want to donate theirs. I wonder if we can almost even create some kind of competitive buzz among the 4 elementary schools to, like, fill your makerspace over the next period of time.
I did attend one PTO meeting where the topic was it generated some enthusiasm, and there was immediately one parent who said, where I work would be happy to make, and they were in fact asking the question, would it be okay for my employer to contribute just to my local elementary school, or would it have to be would it have to be in 4s so that it went to the entire district? And so we talked about the gift giving policy and how the board has to approve those sorts of gifts. But in one conversation, there was interest generated to making those contributions. So, yeah, we spend a year talking about it and building interest and enthusiasm. We might get a lot more for the 100,000 that we end up
Right.
trying
We
to
may program it
budget.
differently, right? It
Perhaps
may
we
end up,
even need to
yeah.
look at increasing the teachers'
right.
0.8 to full-time.
Yep.
We may, I'm just wondering if we've got the time to think about it, if we want to think about increasing those 0.8 teachers that are going to be responsible for the space up to full-time. I don't know
Well-
if that's something that may be palatable. I know it wouldn't be this year, but maybe next year when this is fleshed out a little bit more fully.
And again, I want to be really careful about that. So when I said that they would be associated with the media centers, I meant physically, right? So the media specialists currently have teaching responsibilities of their own, as well as managing that space. It was really intended to be a space to be signed out to classroom teachers or any of the specials teacher, PE teacher, art teacher, music teacher, or media specialist. There are only 2 media specialists, well, there's 4 media specialists at the elementary. 2 are full-time and 2 are 80%. So it might certainly be a consideration. I just want to be cautious because 2 of those employees are already at full-time.
Gotcha.
This is
Okay.
not becoming necessarily a part of the media program or curriculum. They still have theirs. They could use it as much as anybody else. In some ways, it's connected to their space, so there may be some ancillary supervisory responsibility, like opening it in the morning and locking it in the afternoon, but there won't be, you're teaching 5 lessons in
Okay.
here
So
responsibility.
they're not necessarily going to be responsible for curriculum creation for that space?
No.
Okay.
No,
Right to assume that it just the same amount of responsibility they would have for the computer labs.
that's the analog,
Okay.
yes. Yep.
I'm wondering, or I guess I'm making a request, if we were to take out these maker spaces, and we note this 50,000 in the technology plan, which of course is as you have described, right? This is something that gets paid over a 5-year
5 years, I believe,
lease. I would like to be able to, when we're talking to the Board of Finance, have a sense from Kevin Mitchell about
What that value
what that
is, yeah.
might go to
Yes,
instead.
absolutely.
Rather than say, oh, we could do this.
We'll
You
give you
know,
an
I mean, these
itemized
are
list.
people,
Yep,
right? This
exactly right.
is
We'll feel better
money
remember
that our taxpayers are spending. So
Yes.
I would like it to really, I would like to be able to speak about a need that has been
Absolutely.
gone unmet. I mean,
The things that he
that-
wasn't able to afford because of the makerspaces that will work their way
that's
back
right.
in.
I would
Absolutely
like,
right.
so
Yeah,
if,
reprioritize.
Yes.
so I would
In the
suggest.
same way that Mr. Gurnham does with this. the
Right,
site
so I
improvement
guess
fund.
I would suggest, if in fact we as a board are talking about several things tonight and find ourselves wanting to vote next week.
have that for you.
That would be another question that I would love to hear. It could be from you, it doesn't have to be directly, obviously, from Mr. Mitchell, but that he has been consulted and has kind of a thought about what
It'll
that
be
would look like.
From him through me on Monday night.
Perfect, right. I don't need him to come out on another Monday. He is a very busy person. Is there any other thoughts or comments on makerspaces in this part of the meeting? All righty. I know there was an interest in, from at least a couple of board members in thinking about somehow the boys' swim team responding to that, but it sounds like it would be helpful to get some more information about what that might look like. So that's kind of question number 2.
Yeah, just as we said with technology, I'll be able to give you a more detailed response to that this following Monday about if the board was inclined to put more financing towards the boys' swim team, how could that work when they're currently part of a
Right.
collaborative with North Haven for that one more year?
Right.
And then again, what I heard from the community was a real desire when this cooperative sunsets to allow it to sunset and to take under serious consideration this time next year, budgeting for a standalone Guilford swim team.
Yeah.
And so I very clearly came away with that understanding from the comments that we heard
Okay.
from some very articulate
Very well
student
done,
athletes
yeah.
who
Yes.
who advocated for that.
Can swim be co-ed, like track?
So track is technically not co-ed, and one of the biggest problems you run into with swim is that it's 2 different seasons. The girls swim in the fall, and the boys surprisingly swim in the winter. And so I know there have been schools where female athletes have practiced with the boys' team and participated as a team of one, even with their own local team, because they were on a different sport in fall or because they swim 2 seasons. But collapsing the boys and girls teams together for combined practices, the way indoor and outdoor track does, would not be feasible because of the season difference.
That's too bad.
Are there other items, line items that board members would like to talk about?
I think we
I know
covered
there's some
we went through the 4 points from the
from the public
public meeting. You
Right.
gave us your page
Yeah, if I
of
could-
proposed things you want.
Yeah, if I could draw your attention to the proposals, because the proposals always end up becoming sort of a package, and so I wanted to show you what one package could look like. I think we've already migrated away from some of what I sketched out, but I did want to show you what one series of responses could look like. I'd be happy to, if it pleases the board, to walk you through what I put together and show you what that would have, what kind of effect that would have on the bottom line.
Are people fine with that?
Yeah.
Okay,
Sure.
go ahead.
So on the paper that I provided for you first, and we haven't had a lot of conversation on this because I don't think it involves a lot of conversation, but as our budget books went out to you, and as we prepared to present the budget that Monday, as we prepared that Monday morning to present the budget to you later that Monday evening, there is, first off, an error in the budget book that needs to be corrected. So there's a salary line in special education at the high school, and there is a $90,000 correction that needs to be made to that line. The good news is that that line has to be smaller by $90,000. I'm not sitting here tonight saying that we need to add $90,000 to that line, which would be a bigger problem Correcting this, in fact, will give us a starting point of a $90,000 reduction to the budget that we've presented to you and to the community at this time. I've noted retirement savings, and I've left them blank at this time. I've left them blank because in years that we have staffing reductions, the staffing reductions eat up those savings before you recognize savings from retirement. Now, because of subject area certification, that's not absolute. Any teachers this year who retire out of a K through 6 elementary certification, which happens to be 5 of our schools, or English language arts at Adams in the high school, we would recognize no retirement savings. We've already accounted for the savings and the reduction of those positions. However, if we were to recognize a retirement in 712 social studies, there's no offsetting savings from the reductions in K through 6 or English language arts. So there's a possibility that we could recognize some retirement savings this year if, for instance, there was a retirement in social studies and we hired a teacher in at a lower salary level than the teacher who retired out. So while there's some room to maneuver there, I have been arguing caution over the last several years about taking counting on large retirement savings. I'd be more cautious than in any other year because of the size of the staffing reductions this year. But you could assume a $35,000 savings if we were to recognize retirements in areas like social studies, science, PE, music, right? Any of those could generate that type of savings. It would not be irresponsible to budget $35,000 or $70,000 for savings in that line. I would be really resistant to budgeting anything higher than that and might prefer keeping it at 0 because we just don't know where those are going to fall.
Would you be comfortable if we were to budget 75,000 at that in that line item?
Yes, I'd be more comfortable at 35,000, but I would be relatively comfortable at 70,000. I wouldn't be comfortable at any number higher than that. But for purpose of illustration, if we could just leave that for now, the artist in residence, I'm showing a $20,000 reduction. That would be all of the monies that were budgeted for this year. It's the $10,000 that we have currently and the increase, and that is in response to the fact that I heard the community members who didn't see a return on that investment. It does not mean that we will stop talking about art. It doesn't mean that we'll keep working with the teachers about integrating art standards into their classrooms, but if it's not a valuable experience, then I had, for purposes of this illustration, showed the complete 20,000. We could, of course, change that to 10,000 and try to improve what we've got before growing that program. This illustration shows the reduction of the makerspaces, the 50,000 from equipment. We will show you an allocation or reallocation of the technology lease. Again, I want to keep saying, in my mind, that is a delay, not a surrender. But I think that it's a legitimate delay. I have itemized medical spending, and I've left that blank for the purpose of this illustration. There have been a lot of conversations about why we have reduced salary levels as a result of the staffing reductions, but we have not reduced the medical line. I can get into the explanation there. We have consulted with our insurance consultant. That sounded redundant, but we've spoken to our insurance consultant. And at this point, he's recommending that we not reduce that number because the number of people that we insure every year is actually fluid. In fact, we've added 3 insured members since December. So while this will be a reduction, if our teachers have children or get married or change their life situation, you see that number change. So the way that we budget is year over year, and we look at revenues versus expenditures. Revenues are based on how many contracts our employees have, not how many lives we insure. The expenses are based on how many actual claims we have, and sometimes you can add 3 lives and not significantly increase the number of claims.
Right.
Sometimes you can eliminate 5 lives and not significantly reduce the number of claims. So there's room to talk because there's 2 ways to consider the math, It's not here now because of the response from the insurance consultant, but if we hold that for a moment, I want to talk about it more a little bit, in just a few more moments.
Well, can I?
Of course.
Okay.
It's your meeting, not mine.
Well, I understand the conservatism of our insurance consultant on that, but I'd like to have the board consider the following. We've got a reduction of 6 full-time employees. If you want to be conservative and say that each one of those employees had 2 insured people, the employee and 1 other insured, and obviously if they had a family, it would have been a much bigger number. We're talking about a reduction of 12 insured people. Our average cost per insured person is slightly less than $10,000 a person. It seems to me that, yes, I understand that our numbers can go up and down, and I understand that our claims tend to go in cycles.
Yep.
And but when you have 1,500 people covered by the policy, which is about what we've got, the law of large numbers tends to work. And when you're talking about a reduction of 12 insured people, it should, over a period of time, have an impact on your costs.
I guess I'm a little concerned that large, 12 and large are not. But I guess I have some concerns about this, right? And it's a discussion. I'm not sure that, well, first of all, it's a known 6. Beyond that, we don't know, right? In an early retirement, right, I think that's a possibility. And I don't think that large in the scope of the people that are covered in this plan, I'm not sure 12 is large. And that is what we're hearing from Joe Spurgeon. We're hearing, right, that with 6 retirements, 6 layoffs, 6 staff removed from the numbers in what we're looking at, that's not a recommendation within that.
Yeah, and I want to be a
size.
little careful too. Remember that our staff sort of fall across demographics. When we do reductions in force, which we will sort of casually call layoffs when we talk about it, when we do reductions in force, those are specifically based on seniority. So we're talking about our least
Right.
experienced staff. Demographically, those tend to be the people who are more likely covered as singles or pairs and not families. And so the average for that target demographic might be smaller. But I also have an idea, and so I'd like to at least suggest the way that we've been thinking about this in the office. If I can just run through the last few lines, I'd like to suggest what I think might be a way to move forward, which sort of recognizes both of the ways of thinking about this, because they're both right. They're just different ways of thinking about the account. The other reduction that I want to note is that there is a plow truck in the budget, and the plow truck was originally budgeted to be purchased outright this year. We did look into leasing the plow truck. If we lease the plow truck over 3 years, we will make a third of the payments each of the 3 years. It would be a total cost increase of $4,000. But in this budget, it would allow us to reduce the $51,000 we've budgeted this year by $33,000 down to 18. We'd have to budget 18 next year and the year after. And then for a total expense of $4,000 spread across 3 years, we were able to book a $33,000 reduction in the budget in front of us tonight. So I am recommending that we do that. I think that
Is
is,
4,000 finance charges for a $33,000 truck?
no, it's a
$53,000.
$51,000 truck leased
Over
over
3
3
years.
years. And so rather than budgeting the full 51 this year, we'd budget 18, and over the 3, it's about 4 more than we would pay if we bought it outright this year. Since we work on an annual budget, it seems to make sense that we do that. Now, those are and again, these are These are recommendations, but this is also by way of example, because again, I think we've sort of walked a little bit away from one of these examples. There are some increased costs here that I've put down as way of examples as well. First, when we presented the budget to you publicly that Monday evening, we did not have the formal recommendation from the pension committee. We were working on what we thought their recommendation was going to be. The recommendation from the pension committee is in fact $45,000 higher than we presented to you that evening. We have worked for years to try to make the actual recommended level. I think that it makes sense to add the $45,000 and budget this year what the pension committee is recommending we budget.
Absolutely.
So there's a $45,000 increase there. For purpose of this illustration, and I know that I've said that I'll give you more detail when we meet a week from tonight, but if you assumed that there was $5,000, it could be $6,000, it could be $4,000, but if you assumed $5,000 set aside to somehow offset the cost of the monies that the boys swim team parents are currently raising around transportation specifically, I believe, there's a figure there for that. There is a line for tuition contingency. Every year we've talked about special ed and we've talked about it being a miss. For now I've left that blank, but there is certainly room for more conversation about adding additional dollars into the tuition line, the outplacement line for special ed students who are placed out. And this includes an additional $30,000 to site improvements. We've talked over and over about trying to make it back to 1% of our budget in site improvements. This $30,000 doesn't get us there, but it gets us to $555,000, which is very close to $610,000. So I would make that suggestion. If you were to adopt all of the recommendations that are detailed there, and again, I know we've moved off, that would be a net decrease of $113,000 from the budget that we presented to you in full. It would leave the percent increase at 1.95 rather than at the 2.14 that we have currently presented to you. That would allow us to continue to invest in much of what we talked about as the significant investments when we made the first budget presentation to you. It is, in ways, responsive to what we heard at the public hearings. It is responsive to some lack of enthusiasm that we heard around two programs that we have proposed, but it's also responsive to some need that we heard voiced around the swim team. It puts more money into pension and it puts more money into the site improvements that are both boring but responsible places to be investing money. And in fact, it brings us to the Board of Finance below 2% rather than above 2%. Now again, we've already sort of talked around the artist in residence about whether that number should stay the same. But again, for purpose of illustration, if this page, however the board chooses to finalize it tonight or next Monday, ends up with a net reduction in the ballpark of that $113,000, then you will be able to bring forward a budget that is below 2% and responsive to both the needs that the leadership team has articulated and what you've heard from the community through emails and through the public hearings and through conversations that you're having with constituents in the town. I know there's room to move, Mr. Sants. Oh, and then here's the idea. I apologize. It leaves two significant markers open. It leaves both retirement savings and a reduction of the medical line as places for further conversation should the Board of Finance choose to reduce our budget lower. What I like about the way it's presented now is that when we go before the Board of Finance, should we face a reduction as we have in the last 3 or 4 years, this proposal says that we would go to the medical line and or to the retirement savings, and in some combination of those two numbers. So as I said to you, I could be comfortable at $70,000 in a medical reduction, and I could be comfortable in retirement savings, bless you, or $100,000 of $70,000. It gives us significant room to make changes, if necessary, in front of the Board of Finance that will not significantly impact programming in front of our students. It allows the board to budget where you feel you need to budget, but we also know that we're not the final word on this. The Board of Finance does have bottom line decision-making ability before they move it forward.
So So there's an opportunity to talk about any of these things right now. I know, Mr. Sands, you expressed some interest in medical. I don't know if there are other board members who wanted to talk about that line specifically, or any board member wants to talk about any of these proposals, or others, right? That
Yes.
I know that, that each of us has spent a lot of time poring over these budget books, and kind of coming up with our own lists depending on what we thought. So I want to
Sure.
also make sure that, that those things get touched upon tonight as well.
There are lots of blank lines intentionally. This is just one illustration of what a final decision could look like.
So again, I'm reaching out to all of you about either talking about any of these lines or additional things that you want your colleagues here to think about in terms of budget considerations.
Well, I would have a couple. I continue to think that we need to examine this pay-for-play issue more carefully. I'm troubled by the way we're doing it right now, and I think that there may be ways to make some of these athletic extracurricular activities available to students whose families are not as wealthy as others without embarrassing the families or asking them to come beg for money in a way that's degrading to them. And I'm not sure that I understand how to do that, and I'm not sure that that's really the board's role. I would ask the superintendent to think about this and to come up with some other ways of reducing this. But I would think that in addition to what we're proposing for the boys' swim team, that we should be thinking about putting some amount of money, $25,000, $30,000, potentially aside to see if we can reduce this, what I call pay-for-play burden. And how to do it, I think, is something that is up to the management of the district. It's not really up to us to figure this out. And I think that we ought to, I'm hesitant on this issue of how we're going to deal with the Board of Finance. I mean, I would be inclined to go to the Board of Finance with a solid proposal, maybe a reduction below 1.95, and say, this is the best we can do, and see if we can get them to hold at that level. This idea of doing it twice, having these multiple cuts is not constructive to budget making.
Well, the other suggestion that I would make is that there are blanks here for increases as well. If there was a desire to decrease, if there was a desire to take 50,000 from retirement and 50,000 from medical, then I would actually prefer to suggest that we put $100,000 into the tuition line and that we
Right.
create a
Right.
special education contingency.
I agree.
Now, that would in fact be my preferred approach, and then we would be able to bring in a budget that is still at 1.95, but has monies placed where we want to see those monies
And
placed.
it makes concrete our priorities.
Absolutely.
And if someone's going to be arbitrary about, we just want you to cut your budget, because they, in some sense, shouldn't know enough about our budget to make a micro decision, the fact that we've already done that says that we've already made that decision. I was going to raise the same question that Ted did for that reason.
In the Board of Finance's defense, they can only make a bottom line decision.
can't.
They cannot
They cannot make a line item.
I know, but if they see
decision.
a blank space, they might say
Oh.
there's wiggle room there.
They rarely add money to our budget. By the
We're gonna hear more, I mean, I know it'll be a bit too late, because we're gonna talk about it in a workshop in the future. But I do see Mr. Sand's point, and I don't know what the amount looks like. And I remember receiving the letter 2 summers ago about the booster clubs, and they're so, they do so much for the sports teams. And I know that they can be approached, and they can, offer money and support for families that might need it and might be thinking they might be left out of something. But I do hear Mr. Sand's point, and that to try to find the most confidential, nameless, faceless way to do this, so that, because booster groups are parent-run, right?
Well, right, and that's exactly why the letter says
Like
that
a
you
peer,
do not have to
Yeah.
pay to participate in any sport, and if there is any concern, come to us, because we then will be the intermediary with the.
But even if,
But it's still, it's fraught, absolutely.
right,
It's, right,
The
yeah.
problem that I'm struggling with, and I'm not giving up, Mr. Sands, I'll continue thinking about it, but the problem that I'm struggling with is that it is not, technically, it's not pay for play,
No,
it is
no.
altruism and volunteerism.
Right.
And so there are other school districts that have formal pay for play programs. So if you charge a student who plays in any varsity sport $250 to play in each of those sports, and most of the programs have a family cap. So it's $250 per season. No family will pay more than $750 a year. If you are doing it that way, then it's relatively easy to set aside a tuition line item and say that any child who's identified as free and reduced lunch, then the school waives that fee. The difficulty is that we don't charge a fee for any of the programs at any level. Some of the booster clubs, and this is not unusual in high school sports, but some of the booster clubs say things like, there's an anticipated family donation of $100 or $450. And if you can't make that donation, that's fine, but we expect you to sell 15 T-shirts. There's there's the contribution, and then there's the fundraising option. The booster clubs that are to varying degrees independent from the school system, much like our PTOs are, then bundle those contributions or fundraising revenues and gift them to the school system. So it becomes complicated in saying, other than telling parents that you don't have to make those contributions, it becomes complicated in creating a funding stream from the town-approved budget that goes to the fundraising. It's not dissimilar from how elementary schools have been built or playgrounds have been built at 3 of the 4 elementary schools. There was some really positive encouragement, right, to donate, to get I get the alumni mailings from my son's colleges that say, we want 100% participation in this fundraising. Our boosters certainly do that, but they're to greater and lesser degree independent of the school district. And so again, I'm not giving up. I'm voicing how I'm wrestling with that, and I look forward to a workshop meeting where we can add some other people to the conversation and really hash that concern out. I'm hesitant to add a placeholder of $30,000 or $25,000 to this budget Monday evening, because we certainly will not have had that larger, healthier conversation prior to Monday evening.
I would also, I think, be interested in learning more first, because having had kids on sports teams, I know that booster clubs, Dr. Freeman, as you suggest, certainly handle this in somewhat different ways. My experience with the booster clubs that my kids have been on is not even that if you can't put forth kind of the money we're requesting that we ask you to do something else. It's that then you are covered, and you are covered confidentially if you talk to this particular person or talk to the coach. So I think I think the concern that both Mr. Sands and Ms. Sullivan have mentioned about students who are unable to pay what appears to be the fee that would be required is a real concern, right? And I think finding ways to make it even easier for those students and/or parents to approach the school is a great idea. I would like to learn more about what's already being done, though. I don't want us, I'm afraid we're making assumptions about things that aren't being done, and I don't want to base decisions on assumptions. I would like actual information, and I think the best decisions are made when we have actual information about what's already happening. But I
Okay,
certainly am interested in
I'm
other.
prepared to defer this until we have more information on it.
I think at a
But
minimum.
I think
yeah.
it's important that we
not lose
focus on
It's a
this.
real, no, I think, right, I think we
Agreed.
want to make sure that what we offer students
Is fair and
is not,
equitable.
is,
And
is
accessible.
accessible in a number of ways.
Well, and I think at a minimum, we need to sort of, maybe a parent, I don't know where the information comes from, you know, we have the letter, just a gentle reminder to booster clubs about the wording that they
Yep.
may choose to use, because I've been part of several, and it's not always clear that this is
Right,
not
right.
required, or that it's suggested, or that there's other options if you don't have just the cash to give
Right.
into it. And again, at the end of the day, these are parent volunteer groups, and we completely appreciate everything that they do and the equipment that they can purchase and the coaches that they can fund. But it can, as much as we say it can happen, it can be very awkward to have to approach
Oh,
a group
absolutely.
of your
Absolutely.
peers.
So a perfect example is, you know, my daughter's did the freshman volleyball team, and it was suggested that you purchase certain spirit wear. But the spirit wear included the practice jersey, the warm-up shirt, you know, things that you would wear pre-game, post-game. And so if you're the child that doesn't have those,
Yes.
you're kind of not uniformed for
Yeah.
the event. And so it does,
Yeah.
although
Just
it's
have to be
suggested,
cautious.
it's really an expectation. And they don't mean to put that on families, but it's a natural thing of what happens. So I think it's important to look at it deeper.
Got 4 sons on.
It's a lot.
Oh, yeah, you know, yeah. It's just,
Fully equipped.
In response to the approach to the Board of Finance, I would like to kind of offer I guess, a slightly different perspective. I would like us to, as a board, be very clear, and perhaps, Dr. Hirsch, I'm echoing a little bit what you said before. I want to be very clear about what our priorities are, what our concerns are, and where we think the money needs to go. For instance, if we, and we've discussed some of them tonight, have reductions to this budget for reasons of both being conscious, right, of what we're asking taxpayers to do, but also being conscious of what we spend money in. And if we feel like there are items such as the makerspaces, which we've discussed, that we feel like are not fully developed and we don't feel comfortable putting money behind, I think those are really good reductions to make. But I am less interested, quite frankly, in getting to a particular percent and more interested in really making sure that the budget we put in front of the Board of Finance is the one we feel reflects our needs, reflects areas that we feel are best realized with a particular set of funds, recognizes what we've learned over the past few years. So, for instance, I would be interested if we, in the process of reductions, have the ability, for instance, to add to the tuition line. I would recommend we consider that. We
I agree.
have in our budget books, our trends for the last 5 or 6 years. As I've already noted, and I mean this sincerely, we have a business staff and a pupil services staff that work extremely hard in trying to predict this line every year. But if we look at the trends over the last 4 or 5 years, we have consistently been over budget of those predictions.
Yep.
So I like us to consider putting money into, additional monies into those lines if we feel, for instance, that the money is not best suited for the makerspace, but is a place where we might instead put an additional $50,000. I'm simply using that as an example. But really, I think I'm addressing kind of an approach here. I do not feel the need to second-guess the Board of Finance or hedge our bets and cut even further so that they don't present that as their possibility, and in doing so, cut something that we feel really needs the money that's in there right now, or really needs additional funds. We have a really important job, I think, right, of balancing kind of a responsibility to our taxpayers and a responsibility to our students. So I will stop talking. That's enough for me on that subject. But I, again, want to open up conversation if, as I said before, if other people have comments on anything that's been said or anything that they want to introduce.
So
Well,
if
I
we,
would-
oh, go, sorry.
No, go ahead,
If
Amy.
we took some money from medical and some money from retirement, since we haven't really given that any funding, because if we're gonna put money towards tuition, it seems to make sense that we put money towards tuition that is really gonna make, you know what I mean? Because we're just under what we are anticipating, and if we could get to that place, that's 50 and 50, you know?
You'd want it to be at least $100,000.
Right.
You want it to be at least
Anything would be helpful, but it's
Right.
not going to be a significant
Right, something that's
contribution.
These
really
order of
gonna,
Right, so whether it was 70,000 in retirement and 30 from medical, whether it was 50 and 50, that would be money that going into going into tuition rather, would be a significant investment, and it would.
And realistic.
Yes, and it would go to closing that gap that we've seen on the graph. I mean, remember, that graph, we always know what direction it's gonna go, but we have not pulled those lines together in 7 years.
Yeah.
So $100,000 or greater would go to closing, shrinking or closing that gap.
I'd be much more comfortable at 150 than I would at 100 because, these outplacements, they don't come at $75,000 and $100,000. I mean, they're much more expensive.
So, let's just be clear, some of them do and some of them don't.
Right.
Right, some of them do and some of them don't. It is what it makes it so hard, right, to predict that line.
Full residential placements would be significant, but a partial day placement.
Could be
right, yep.
$50,000,
Yes,
right?
yep.
It is what makes it so difficult. And again, I think we want to be careful really to fund what we expect and predict. I am just very concerned that over 5 or 6 years, we have been so, it's been so challenging. I just want to be really careful.
You can predict where that dot's going to fall.
That's right. So I'm throwing that out there just as another consideration. Are there other things that anyone wants to address as, again, possibilities?
I'll just say again, medical and retirement to get to hopefully at that 100,000 at least for
Well, and
tuition, and then, because I do like that you've added in more funding for the site improvements. I know we're doing a lot of projects, and finishing up projects, but we need to invest in the building so that we're not in a
Working back to that
situation.
$610,000 mark is really what we want to be doing.
Yeah.
If we were to make the adjustment to artist in residence to be down $10,000, that would keep it at the current funding, and we have heard the feedback from the board and from the community, and we know the importance of debriefing and learning. If you were to reduce that from 20 to 10 in reductions, and then again, if you were to do retirement savings of 70 and a medical reduction of 40, it keeps the bottom line
100,000.
It keeps the bottom line at that $113,000 net, which still, and I know we're not looking for a target. I know that we are looking to budget what our schools need. But to come in below 2%, I think, does send a message to the whole community, not just the Board of Finance, about how hard we have worked on this budget. The 2.14 is the lowest budget that's ever come from the leadership to the board, but it's not the lowest that's ever gone from the board to the Board of
Right,
Finance in the last few years.
Yeah. And next year, when our payments for the high school start to go down,
They've decreased.
we'll have a slight bit more wiggle room than we have this year.
Not in our budget, but in the total
Total
package,
package,
right.
yeah.
My understanding is that the bonding portion of the budget, which is the smallest of the three portions, right? The school makes up the biggest portion of the town budget, and then there's the town operating budget, and then there's the bonding. But the bonding this year is going up, I think, 10 or 11%, and so there is a significant increase. It's the smallest of the three portions, but that's the largest of the three increases. That doesn't apply directly to our budget build or what we look at that the schools need, but we're certainly aware of the outside pressures that the town has, and we try to bring forward a responsible
Right, and
budget.
It's certainly what the Board of Finance is
Will
sitting
weigh.
considering,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
They're looking at what the town proposed budget comes in, what the Board of Education proposed budget comes in. They're
With the
looking
bonding,
at
Mm-hmm.
that bonding,
Yeah.
as well as looking at revenue side as well. So I know there are a couple of questions that Dr. Freeman has offered to bring, to kind of look into and bring back next week. We've certainly talked in some detail about issues both from a conceptual kind of rollout standpoint, as well as in some numbers. We have somewhat tangentially, but equally important, identified some things we'd like to discuss conceptually in future meetings. Unless other people have specific things, and we certainly can continue talking here. We may want to decide whether people are ready tonight to vote, or whether this is a good opportunity to really think about our colleagues' suggestions, Dr. Freeman's suggestions, get some answers from Dr. Freeman on some specific items, really, for next week. One, again, about swimming, boys swimming.
A detailed response.
Detailed response, a more informed response, and a response also on
Technologies.
technology. It sounds like most of us, we have not voted, and I don't want to represent everyone, that there is at least a couple of voices that are uniformly thinking that the makerspaces being pulled out of the budget is a good idea. What would, if we left 50,000 in the technology lease, what would that be spent on? What would be the proposal?
Additionally, I've got two topics for future workshop meetings. One would be around athletic funding, and one would be around the length of the elementary school day. And I really appreciate the support that I have heard from the board around the increases to site improvement, to pension, and to tuition. It's really encouraging to be able to go away knowing that you're asking for us to find a way to put those back into this budget. So I just want to voice our appreciation.
I move that we defer the budget vote until next week.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that's right.
Okay. So I've heard a first and a second. Any more conversation before we vote on that? No. All in favor? Aye. Anybody against or no? Okay, so,
May I just remind the board that we
Please.
can continue to develop that Q&A document, and so if there are specific questions
Perfect.
that come up between now and next Monday, if you send those through Dr. Balistraci and then to us, we'll continue adding to the bottom of that. I think we're 50 questions in on the Q&A document. We can certainly add more to those between now and next Monday.
okay. Thank you so much. So that was, again, the one other agenda item we had tonight. We are putting on hold until next Monday, which was, again, the appointment of the replacement for our, at the moment, empty Board of Ed seat.
Should we go into executive session to have that discussion tonight?
We cannot, unfortunately, we can't do it tonight because this is a special meeting.
Can't add agenda items to a
Yeah,
special
and,
meeting.
and we, several of us thought that might be a possibility. Dr. Hirsch, I have learned since that, been reminded that we can't do that. So we will.
notice a special
We will certainly notice a special meeting for executive session to allow the board to have final consideration, and then bring it to a vote at next week's meeting.
So would you like me to ask Terry to schedule an executive session prior to the operations meeting, or keep a tight operations agenda and try to leave time for a half-hour special session at 7 o'clock?
I think we can get through the operations agenda on an expedited basis.
We'll keep a tight operations budget from 6 to 7, and then we will schedule an executive
We can all
session from
agree on
7 to 7:30 prior to your regular meeting.
I think that's the way to do it.
Okay.
That's a good idea.
Okay.
Yes.
Excellent. So I first am just going to take the opportunity once again to thank our business office, Mrs. Trudeau in particular. We have been fielding many questions her way and getting responses to each of them, and we really appreciate your continued willingness to help us as we work through this process. Given that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn this meeting.
Second?
Someone else has to make the motion. Go ahead.
I thought I heard
It's
it.
like, no, let's go.
So moved. Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you all very much. That was a lot of late nights. Katie, I'm just thinking, if we have